The avoidant disappears with finality that feels absolute, withdraws completely, creates impenetrable distance, communicates through their absence that the relationship is over and they have moved on without looking back. Weeks or months pass in silence that you interpret as closure, as confirmation that they meant what their departure implied, as evidence that whatever connection existed has been permanently severed. You begin the painful work of acceptance, of rebuilding your life around the gap their absence created, of learning to exist without the person who occupied so much psychological space, despite being emotionally unavailable the entire time you knew them. And then they return. Not with apology or explanation, not with acknowledgement of the hurt their disappearance caused, not with evidence that anything fundamental has changed about their capacity for sustained intimacy. They return as though the absence was brief and inconsequential, as though you should be grateful they are reaching out, as though reconnection can happen without addressing the pattern that made disconnection necessary. The return feels confusing, destabilizing, like evidence that maybe they did care after all, that maybe the connection mattered more than their withdrawal suggested, that maybe this time will be different because they came back, which must mean something significant about their feelings. But the return is not what it appears to be. The avoidant is not coming back because they realized they love you, because they have done psychological work that makes intimacy possible, because they are ready to show up differently and sustain the presence the relationship always required. The avoidant is coming back for reasons that have nothing to do with genuine transformation and everything to do with their own internal psychological needs that your absence has made unbearable. Understanding why the avoidant keeps coming back requires abandoning the romantic interpretation that return equals love and excavating the actual mechanisms driving behavior that looks like commitment but functions as continued avoidance. The uncomfortable truth is that the avoidant returns not because you matter in the way you want to matter, but because you serve specific psychological functions that the avoidant cannot access elsewhere or replace easily. The return is not about you as a person. It is about what your presence provides that makes the avoidance defensive patterns manageable, what accommodation you offered that other people refused to provide, what specific conditions you created that allowed the avoidant to feel wanted without having to risk genuine vulnerability. The avoidant comes back because leaving you created problems they did not anticipate, because your absence removed psychological supports they did not consciously recognize they were depending on, because their nervous system determined that the discomfort of being without you exceeds the discomfort of returning, despite nothing about their capacity for intimacy having changed. This is not love. Love requires reciprocity, requires showing up consistently, requires doing the work that sustained intimacy demands. What the avoidant feels when they return is need disguised as desire, dependency they cannot acknowledge masked as choice, the desperate attempt to restore equilibrium, their nervous system lost when you were no longer available to regulate it. The pattern of leaving and returning is not evidence of deep feeling that the avoidant struggles to express. It is evidence of attachment, dysfunction, where the avoidant can only want you when distance has been established and can only create distance when closeness threatens to become real. Understanding the actual reasons the avoidant keeps coming back is essential for protecting yourself from a cycle that will repeat endlessly until the psychological mechanisms driving it are addressed through genuine therapeutic work the avoidant is almost certainly not doing. Number 1, you provide specific regulation their nervous system needs, but cannot access alone. The avoidant returns because your presence provides biological co-regulation that their nervous system requires to function optimally, and your absence has revealed that their vaunted self-sufficiency was actually dependency on you that they never consciously acknowledged. The avoidant genuinely believes they are independent, that they manage their emotional state through their own internal resources, that they do not need other people for the kind of support and regulation that more attached individuals require. This belief is fundamental to their identity and crucial for maintaining the psychological defenses that keep them feeling safe in a world where emotional dependency feels dangerous. But beneath this conscious belief, their nervous system has been using your presence as a regulatory resource the entire time you were together, even while the avoidant was performing detachment and claiming not to need you. When you are calm, their nervous system settles. When you are present without demands, their anxiety decreases. When you provide steady grounding through your own regulated state, their dysregulation finds baseline more easily than it ever does when they are completely alone. This co-regulation happens beneath conscious awareness, at the level of biology rather than psychology, and the avoidant does not recognize it is occurring, because recognizing it would mean admitting dependency that contradicts their self-sufficient identity. Subscribe to understand the hidden biological mechanisms that drive attachment patterns people cannot consciously recognize or control. Your absence removes this regulatory resource, and the avoidance nervous system begins showing signs of chronic dysregulation that cannot be explained by any identifiable current stressor. Sleep becomes disrupted in ways that feel random and cannot be traced to specific anxiety. Focus fragments and concentration becomes difficult without obvious cause. Baseline irritability increases. Relationships with other people become more effortful. The general sense of being okay in the world deteriorates in subtle but accumulating ways. The avoidant does not connect these symptoms to your absence because they do not understand that your presence was providing regulation, so they attribute the dysregulation to other factors: work stress, seasonal changes, general life difficulties. But the symptoms persist and worsen regardless of what the avoidant does to address them through their usual self-management strategies. The self-sufficiency techniques that normally work: exercise, meditation, staying busy, focusing on goals, fail to restore the baseline they are trying to reach. The avoidant is attempting to self-regulate back to an equilibrium that was actually maintained through co-regulation with you. And no amount of independent effort can replace what your nervous system was providing to theirs through simple presence and attunement. The return happens when the dysregulation becomes unbearable enough that the avoidance nervous system overrides their psychological defenses and demands they restore contact with the person who is providing regulation they did not know they were receiving. This is not conscious decision-making, where the avoidant recognizes they need you and chooses to reach out. This is biology demanding they return to the regulatory resource their system requires, generating enough discomfort in the absence that reaching out feels like the only way to make the dysregulation stop. The avoidant does not understand this is why they are returning. They will provide other explanations. They were thinking about you, they wondered how you are doing, they wanted to check in. But these explanations are rationalizations their conscious mind creates to make sense of behavior. Their nervous system is compelling. The actual driver of the return is biological need for the co-regulation you provide, and this need has nothing to do with love or genuine desire for relationship, and everything to do with the avoidance nervous system determining it cannot maintain optimal functioning without the regulatory resource your presence offers. This is why the avoidant can come back without having changed anything about their capacity for intimacy. They are not returning because they are ready to be different. They are returning because their nervous system needs what you provide, regardless of whether they can sustain the intimacy that receiving it requires. The pattern will repeat because the mechanism driving it is biological rather than psychological. And biology does not change through conscious intention or promises to do better next time. Number 2. Your absence activated the abandonment wound they spent their life trying to prevent experiencing. The avoidant constructs their entire relational strategy around ensuring they are never the one who gets abandoned, never the one who is left, never the vulnerable party experiencing the rejection they believe is inevitable if anyone gets close enough to see them clearly. They accomplish this by leaving first, by maintaining enough distance that departures cannot hurt them deeply, by ensuring they care less so that endings happen on their terms. This strategy has protected them from the core abandonment wound that lives beneath all their defenses, The wound formed in childhood when caregivers were inconsistent, unavailable, or made the avoidant feel their needs were burdensome. But when you enforce actual distance, when you stop pursuing despite their withdrawal, when you treat their departure as the final ending it appeared to be, rather than a test you are supposed to pass by, continuing to reach out, something devastating happens to the avoidance psychological framework. They left first, initiated the distance, made the decision to end things. Yet, they are experiencing abandonment anyway. The strategy that was supposed to protect them from ever feeling abandoned has failed catastrophically because you refusing to maintain contact after they left is a form of abandonment their defenses were never designed to manage. The avoidant is confronted with the exact wound they have spent their entire relational life trying to avoid. The experience of not mattering enough for someone to fight for them, of being easy to let go, of their absence being accepted rather than protested. Your silence after their departure communicates that you are okay without them, that you do not need them desperately enough to violate your own boundaries. By continuing to pursue someone who withdrew, that losing them was painful, but survivable, and you have survived it. This triggers the abandonment wound so intensely that the avoidant cannot function. The wound activation does not feel like hurt feelings or disappointment about a relationship ending. It feels like confirmation of their deepest fear about themselves, that they are fundamentally unworthy of sustained love, that anyone who gets to know them will eventually decide they are not worth the effort, that they will always end up alone because there is something defective about them that makes them unlovable at their core. The avoidant believed that leaving first would prevent them from ever having to feel this, would keep them safe from experiencing the rejection they assume is inevitable. Your enforcement of their decision proves the rejection is not inevitable. It is happening right now, and leaving first did not protect them from it at all. This wound activation creates psychological pain the avoidant cannot bear. Every moment of your continued silence is evidence that confirms the wound, that proves they were right to believe they are unlovable, that demonstrates no one actually wants them enough to tolerate their patterns. The pain is not about missing you specifically. It is about what your absence represents about their core worth as a person. If you, who saw their patterns and stayed despite them, who tolerated their withdrawal and accommodated their limitations, who showed more patience than anyone has a right to expect, have now decided they are not worth maintaining contact with, then the avoidant's worst belief about themselves must be true. The return happens when the pain of the wound activation exceeds the avoidant's capacity to manage it through their usual defenses. They need evidence that contradicts the wound, need proof that someone still wants them, despite their unavailability, need to restore the sense that they matter to someone, even if they cannot show up in ways that would make mattering to them sustainable. The return is not about wanting relationship. It is about desperately needing to repair the wound your absence activated, needing you to demonstrate through responding that they are not as unlovable as your silence made them feel. The avoidant will not articulate this as their reason for returning, because they are not consciously aware that abandonment wound activation is driving their behavior. They will offer other explanations that sound more benign. They missed you. They made a mistake leaving. They want to try again. But the actual mechanism is wound-based rather than desire-based. And until the wound is addressed through genuine therapeutic work, the pattern will continue. The avoidant will leave again when intimacy triggers their defenses. You will enforce distance again. The wound will activate again. And they will return again, seeking relief from pain that has nothing to do with love and everything to do with their own unhealed attachment trauma. Demanding evidence they are not as fundamentally defective and unlovable as they have always feared. Number 3. They discovered no one else tolerates their patterns the way you did. The avoidant left, expecting that new people would provide the same basic accommodation you provided, the patience with their withdrawal, the tolerance for inconsistency, the emotional labor of maintaining connection despite receiving minimal reciprocal effort. They assumed your willingness to stay through their patterns was standard relationship behavior, rather than exceptional capacity that required them to do no work on their own attachment issues. They believed that if they could just find someone more compatible or less demanding, they would be able to sustain connection without the discomfort your needs for basic intimacy generated. What they discovered in your absence is that other people are not willing to accommodate what you accommodated. New people respond to withdrawal by leaving rather than pursuing. They interpret coldness as disinterest and disengage rather than trying harder. They establish boundaries around what they will tolerate and enforce those boundaries by ending things when the avoidant cannot meet reasonable relationship expectations. The avoidant is confronted with the reality that normal people do not stay through extreme emotional unavailability, do not make endless allowances for someone who cannot show up consistently, do not sacrifice their own needs indefinitely to accommodate someone else's attachment wounds. This confrontation happens through a series of failed connections that follow the same pattern. The avoidant meets someone promising, generates initial interest, begins spending time together. As soon as intimacy deepens enough to trigger the avoidant's defenses, they withdraw in the exact same way they withdrew from you. But instead of the other person accommodating the withdrawal and trying to bridge the distance, they simply stop engaging. The connection ends within weeks instead of lasting months or years, leaving the avoidant confused about why no one seems willing to give them the space they need to feel comfortable. What the avoidant does not understand is that the space they need to feel comfortable is not reasonable space that healthy people provide each other in relationships. It is extreme distance that prevents actual intimacy from forming. You provided that distance while still maintaining enough connection that the relationship continued existing. You performed the impossible task of staying engaged with someone who was perpetually disengaged, of sustaining your own interest and investment while receiving almost nothing consistent in return. This was not standard relationship behavior. It was extraordinary emotional labor that most people are not capable of or willing to perform. The avoidant took this for granted while you were together, mistaking your capacity to tolerate their patterns as evidence that their patterns were not that problematic. They believed that if you could handle their withdrawal, then their withdrawal must be within the range of normal relationship challenges, rather than evidence of severe attachment dysfunction. Your absence and the resulting failure of every new connection attempts forces them to recognize that you were not providing standard patience. You were accommodating behavior that is objectively intolerable to people with healthy attachment and appropriate boundaries. The return happens when the avoidant realizes that replicating what you provided is impossible, that no one else will do the work you did to keep connection alive despite their withdrawal, that they took for granted something irreplaceable they assumed was standard. This realization is not about recognizing your value as a person or appreciating the sacrifice you made. It is purely practical recognition that you provided something specific. The avoidant needs to maintain any relationship at all, and that thing cannot be found elsewhere. The return is thus strategic rather than emotional. The avoidant is not coming back because they love you. They are coming back because you are the only person they have ever encountered who would tolerate their patterns long enough for them to feel comfortable staying, and every attempt to find that tolerance elsewhere has failed. They need you not as a partner, but as the specific accommodation that makes their dysfunction manageable, as the person who enables them to remain exactly as avoidant as they are, without facing the immediate consequences that avoidance generates with everyone else. This is why nothing changes when they return. They are not coming back having learned that their patterns are the problem. They are coming back having learned that you are the solution that allows them to avoid addressing the problem. The return reinforces their belief that their patterns are fine, and the real issue is just finding someone patient enough to accommodate them, which you have already proven yourself to be. The cycle will repeat until you refuse to provide the accommodation anymore, which forces the avoidant to either find someone else willing to perform that impossible role or finally face that their patterns require therapeutic intervention rather than continued enablement. Number 4. Your absence removed the ego supply they were getting from being wanted, despite being unavailable. The avoidant self-worth in relationships is built on a specific dynamic: being desired and pursued despite offering minimal emotional availability in return. This dynamic confirms that they have value, that they are wanted, that their unavailability does not make them unlovable. As long as someone is continuing to invest in them, despite receiving little consistent reciprocation, the avoidant can maintain the belief that they matter, that they are desirable, that they have power in the relationship through their ability to be wanted while withholding full presence. Your continued pursuit throughout the relationship while they remained emotionally distant provided constant supply to the avoidant's ego. Every time you reached out despite their withdrawal, every time you accommodated their need for space, every time you stayed patient through their coldness, you were confirming their worth. The avoidant could tell themselves they must be special, must be valuable, must be worth the effort if someone was willing to tolerate so much unavailability, to maintain connection with them. Your pursuit, despite their retreat, became evidence of their desirability that the avoidant used to maintain self-esteem while offering nothing vulnerable or genuine in return. When you stop pursuing, when you accept their departure as final and make no attempt to maintain contact, the ego supply stops immediately. The avoidant is confronted with silence where they expected continued evidence of being wanted. They are no longer receiving the confirmation that they matter to someone, that they are desired despite their limitations, that they have value even while being emotionally withholding. The absence of this supply creates a specific kind of distress that has nothing to do with missing you as a person and everything to do with missing the validation your pursuit provided about their own worth. The avoidant in this state begins questioning themselves in ways they were protected from while you were pursuing. If you have stopped reaching out, does that mean they were not as special as your pursuit made them feel? If you have moved on without fighting for them, does that mean they are not actually worth the effort they believed they were? If you can exist without them successfully, does that mean the power they thought they had through being wanted was actually just your choice to stay rather than their inherent value? These questions create an identity crisis for the avoidant whose self-worth depends on being pursued despite being unavailable. The return happens when the avoidant needs to restore the ego supply your silence has removed. They reach out not because they want relationship or have done any work on their patterns, but because they need evidence that you still want them, that they still matter to you, that their unavailability did not make them so worthless that you were able to let go completely. They are seeking confirmation that they are still desirable, still worth pursuing, still valuable enough that you will respond despite them having offered nothing to warrant that response. This is why the avoidance return often involves testing behavior, reaching out casually to see if you will engage, sending vague messages that require you to do the work of initiating real conversation, creating scenarios where you demonstrate continued investment without them having to risk anything vulnerable. They are not reaching out to reconnect genuinely. They are reaching out to confirm you still want them enough to respond, which will restore the ego supply your absence eliminated. When you do respond, when you engage with their return, you restore the dynamic that provides the supply they need. They are once again wanted, despite being unavailable, pursued, despite offering nothing consistent, valued despite being unable to show up. This confirms their worth in the specific way their ego requires and allows them to feel comfortable again. But the moment you stop providing the supply, the moment you establish boundaries, stop pursuing, require reciprocity, the avoidant will withdraw again because they only wanted the supply, not the actual relationship that providing supply would require them to participate in authentically. The pattern is endless, as long as you continue providing the ego supply through your responses to their returns. Each time they come back and you engage, you confirm that they can have your validation without having to change their patterns, can feel wanted without having to be available, can maintain their sense of worth through your continued investment despite offering nothing sustainable in return. The only way to break this cycle is to refuse to provide the supply, which forces the avoidant to either find it elsewhere or develop actual self-worth that does not depend on being pursued by someone they are withholding genuine presence from. Number 5. The fantasy they constructed about you in absence cannot be replicated in reality with anyone else. The avoidance relationship with you does not exist primarily in the time you spend together. It exists in the elaborate fantasy they construct in the spaces between contact, in the version of you they create in their minds that is perfect, because it is completely under their control. In the avoidance internal world, you are exactly what they need: present but not demanding, available but not consuming, interested but not requiring reciprocation. The fantasy version of you provides all the warmth and connection the avoidant craves, with none of the vulnerability or sustained presence that actual relationship demands. This fantasy intensifies dramatically in your absence, without the reality of your actual needs and presence to contradict it. The avoidant can imagine you as the perfect partner they were unable to appreciate while you were available. In fantasy, they can be intimate with you without anxiety, vulnerable without terror, close without the overwhelming need to create distance. They replay conversations they never had, imagine scenarios where they show up differently, create entire narratives about what the relationship could be if only they were capable of being the person their fantasy self can be so easily. The fantasy becomes more real to the avoidant than any actual relationship could be, because in fantasy there is no risk. The you that exists in their mind will never reject them, never leave, never see the defectiveness they believe lives at their core. The fantasy relationship provides the emotional satisfaction of intimacy without any of the danger that actual intimacy triggers. The avoidant can feel close to you, can experience vulnerability, can imagine being loved, all while maintaining complete safety, because none of it is happening in reality where they could actually be hurt. When the avoidant attempts new relationships, they discover that real people cannot compete with the fantasy version of you they have been living with. Real people have actual needs, real emotional responses, genuine expectations for reciprocity. Real people are not under the avoidant's control, do not exist only to provide what the avoidant needs without requiring anything in return, cannot be paused or controlled when they start demanding more than the avoidant can give. Every real person is measured against the fantasy you and found inadequate because reality can never match fantasy that requires nothing vulnerable from the avoidant. The return happens when the avoidant realizes they have developed an attachment to the fantasy version of you that cannot be replaced by actual connection with actual people. They come back seeking the person who exists in their imagination, believing that reconnecting with the real you will somehow make the fantasy version accessible. They have convinced themselves through months of fantasy that you are the one person they could be intimate with if given another chance, that the relationship could work if only they were able to show up the way their fantasy self shows up so effortlessly. But the return is doomed from the beginning because the avoidant is not actually returning to you. They are returning to their fantasy of you. And the moment your real presence contradicts that fantasy by having actual needs or expecting genuine reciprocity, the avoidance defenses will activate and they will need to create distance again. The cycle repeats because the avoidant keeps coming back to a person who does not exist, a fantasy constructed in the safety of their own mind that cannot survive contact with the reality of what actual relationship with them requires. The avoidant does not consciously understand they are chasing fantasy, rather than desiring real relationship. They genuinely believe they want you, that they are coming back because they realize what they lost, that this time will be different. But what they actually want is the version of you that exists only in their imagination. The relationship that can only happen in the mental space where they have complete control and face no genuine risk. As long as they are chasing this fantasy, they will keep coming back and keep leaving again when reality fails to match the impossible standard that fantasy created. Number 6. they are addicted to the cycle itself, rather than wanting sustained relationship. The avoidant is not seeking stable, consistent intimacy. They are seeking the specific emotional intensity that comes from the cycle of withdrawal and reconnection. The pattern of leaving and returning creates a relationship rhythm that the avoidant has become psychologically dependent on, because it provides the only form of closeness their nervous system can tolerate. The cycle allows them to experience want without sustained presence, feel close without consistent vulnerability, appear to be in relationship without actually inhabiting one fully. This cycle becomes addictive because it creates emotional highs during reconnection that would be impossible in stable relationship. When the avoidant returns after absence, the reunion generates intensity, the relief of reconnection, the validation of being wanted back, the temporary suspension of their anxiety about intimacy because the distance they just created makes closeness feel safe again. This intensity feels like love, like passion, like evidence that the connection is special and worth preserving. The avoidant becomes dependent on these reunion highs because they are the only moments when they can feel close to someone without terror immediately activating. But the intensity cannot be sustained because it depends on the distance that preceded it. Once the reunion high fades and regular presence is required, the avoidant's anxiety about intimacy returns, and they need to create distance again to make the closeness manageable. The withdrawal is not about you doing anything wrong, or the avoidant falling out of love. It is the necessary part of the cycle that will allow the next reunion to generate the intensity the avoidant is addicted to. They need to leave so they can come back, need to create distance, so reconnection will feel good enough to temporarily override their anxiety about sustained intimacy. The avoidant who is addicted to this cycle cannot function in stable relationship because stable relationship does not provide the intensity they have come to depend on. Consistent presence feels boring at best and suffocating at worst because it lacks the emotional highs that separation and reunion create. The avoidant needs the drama of the cycle, the pain of distance followed by the relief of reconnection, the anxiety of wondering if you will take them back, followed by the validation when you do, the push-pull dynamic that keeps them feeling engaged without ever having to be fully present. This is why the avoidant keeps coming back even when relationship clearly is not working, even when the pattern has caused tremendous harm, even when both parties claim to be done with the cycle. The avoidant is not coming back because they want to make the relationship work. They are coming back because they are addicted to the feeling that coming back creates, to the intensity of reunion that allows them to temporarily feel intimate without the terror that sustained intimacy generates. They need the cycle to continue because without it, they lose access to the only form of closeness their nervous system can tolerate. The return is thus not about missing you or recognizing your value or being ready to change. It is about needing their addiction met, needing the hit of reunion intensity that will temporarily satisfy their need for closeness without requiring sustained vulnerability. As long as you participate in the cycle by accepting their returns, you are enabling an addiction that prevents the avoidant from ever developing the capacity for actual stable intimacy. The only way to break this pattern is to refuse to participate in the cycle, to enforce boundaries that prevent the reunion high from happening, which forces the avoidant to either find another person to cycle with or face that they need therapeutic help to develop capacity for intimacy that does not depend on constant separation and reunion. Number 7. Returning allows them to avoid the discomfort of genuine change while appearing to be trying. The avoidant is aware on some level that their patterns are destructive, that their inability to sustain intimacy is causing them to lose relationships that matter, that they need to change if they want different outcomes. This awareness creates discomfort and pressure to do something differently. But actual change is terrifying because it would require confronting their attachment wounds, sitting with vulnerability that feels unbearable. risking intimacy without the defenses that have kept them psychologically safe their entire life. Returning to you provides the perfect solution to this dilemma. It allows the avoidant to appear to be making an effort toward change without having to do the actual work that change requires. By coming back, they can tell themselves and you that they are trying, that they recognize they made a mistake leaving, that they want to do better. The return itself becomes evidence of effort and growth that requires no genuine transformation, no therapeutic work, no confrontation with the core wounds driving their patterns. You accepting their return reinforces this illusion. Your willingness to give them another chance confirms that the return was enough, that trying means coming back rather than actually changing, that they can maintain their patterns while appearing to be working on them. The avoidant gets credit for effort they are not making, gets to feel like they are addressing the problem by simply re-engaging rather than doing the deep work their attachment issues require. This allows the avoidant to avoid the truly uncomfortable path of genuine change, therapy specifically focused on attachment trauma, learning to sit with feelings instead of suppressing them immediately, practicing vulnerability in small doses despite the terror it generates, understanding that their defensive strategies are hurting them more than protecting them. All of this work is bypassed by the simple act of returning, which creates the appearance of trying without requiring any actual transformation of the patterns that made leaving feel necessary in the first place. The avoidant will keep coming back as long as returning is accepted as sufficient evidence of effort and growth. Each return allows them to temporarily relieve the discomfort of knowing they need to change without having to actually change. Each time you accept the return, you confirm that the pattern can continue, that they can keep leaving and returning indefinitely without ever having to do the genuine work that would allow them to stay. The uncomfortable truth is that the avoidant keeps coming back, not because you are special or irreplaceable or loved in the way you want to be loved. They keep coming back because you serve specific functions that make their dysfunction manageable, because your absence activated wounds that feel unbearable, because no one else will tolerate their patterns, because they need the ego supply your pursuit provides, because you cannot compete with the fantasy version of yourself they constructed, because they are addicted to the cycle rather than wanting stable relationship, and because returning allows them to avoid genuine change while appearing to try. None of these reasons are about love. All of them are about the avoidant's own unaddressed psychological needs that your presence temporarily satisfies without requiring them to transform the patterns that will inevitably cause them to leave again. Why understanding? This changes everything about how you respond. Recognizing that the avoidance return is not driven by love or genuine desire for relationship fundamentally changes how you should respond when they reach out after disappearing. The natural response when someone comes back is to interpret it as evidence they care, as proof the connection mattered, as hope that this time might be different because they clearly regret leaving or they would not be returning. This interpretation makes you vulnerable to repeating the cycle indefinitely because it misunderstands what is actually driving the return. When you understand that the avoidant is returning to meet their own unexamined needs rather than because they are ready to show up differently, you can protect yourself from the pattern repeating. You recognize that their return is not the beginning of change but the continuation of dysfunction. You see that accepting them back without evidence of genuine therapeutic work is enabling their avoidance rather than supporting their growth. You understand that your willingness to engage with their return is providing exactly what allows them to avoid confronting their patterns while appearing to address them. This understanding creates space for different choices. Instead of interpreting the return as romantic gesture that deserves immediate response, you can require evidence that actual change is happening. You can ask what therapeutic work they have done since leaving, what they understand differently about their patterns, what specific behavioral changes they are committed to implementing. You can establish that return without evidence of genuine transformation is not acceptable, that you are no longer willing to participate in a cycle that serves their psychological needs while destroying your own well-being. Most importantly, you can recognize that the avoidant coming back is not about you at all. It is not about your value or your importance to them, or the strength of the connection you shared. It is about their own internal psychological machinery trying to resolve discomfort through returning to a dynamic that has always temporarily made their dysfunction manageable. This recognition protects you from the trap of believing that, if you just try harder, give them another chance. Be more patient this time. The relationship will finally work. The relationship cannot work until the avoidant addresses their core attachment, wounds through sustained therapeutic intervention, and your acceptance of their returns without that work, having been done actively, prevents the confrontation with consequences that might motivate them to seek help. The only reasons that would actually matter. If the avoidant were returning for reasons that suggested genuine potential for transformation, those reasons would look completely different from the mechanisms outlined above. The avoidant whose return actually means something would come back having done sustained work in therapy, specifically focused on attachment trauma. They would be able to articulate their patterns with clarity and specificity, naming exactly how their avoidance manifests and the harm it causes. They would acknowledge the pain their withdrawal created, without minimizing or justifying it. The avoidant whose return matters would not arrive with casual texts testing whether you are still available. They would reach out with humility and accountability, with recognition that their departure caused damage that cannot be undone through simple reconnection. They would understand that you have every right to protect yourself by maintaining distance, that their return is not something you owe them. Engagement with, that rebuilding trust after their patterns destroyed it, requires sustained demonstration of different behavior over months, not promises that things will be different this time. Most critically, the avoidant whose return actually indicates readiness for relationship would understand that return is not the same as reunion, that reaching out does not mean you are obligated to take them back, that they need to earn their way back through consistent demonstration of change rather than expecting you to give them another chance based on nothing but their reappearance. They would respect whatever boundaries you establish, including the boundary that you are not interested in reconnecting unless and until they have done genuine work on their attachment wounds that has lasted long enough to create actual transformation rather than temporary insight. These are the signs that would matter. Evidence of genuine therapeutic work, ability to articulate patterns with painful clarity, humility about the harm caused, respect for your boundaries, understanding that return does not equal automatic reconnection. The avoidant who comes back without these things is coming back for the reasons outlined above, to meet their own psychological needs at your expense, to restore functions you were serving without having to change their capacity to participate in actual relationship, to continue the cycle that allows them to avoid the genuine work their patterns require. Why the cycle will repeat until you break it. The pattern of the avoidant leaving and returning is not random, and it is not evidence of deep feelings they struggle to manage. It is a functional cycle that serves specific purposes for the avoidant's psychological system, and as long as those purposes are being served, the cycle will continue indefinitely. Each time you accept their return without requiring evidence of change, you confirm that the pattern works, that they can have the benefits of your presence without the costs of genuine intimacy, that leaving and returning is an acceptable relationship rhythm, rather than evidence of dysfunction that requires intervention. The avoidant learns from your acceptance of their returns that their patterns are tolerable, that no real consequences follow their withdrawal, that you will always be available when they need what you provide, regardless of how many times they disappear. This learning reinforces their belief that their avoidance is manageable, that they do not need to change, that they can continue operating exactly as they are while maintaining access to connection when their nervous system demands it. Breaking this cycle requires you to do what feels counterintuitive and emotionally difficult, refusing to participate in the return, maintaining boundaries even when the avoidant comes back, requiring evidence of genuine change before considering reconnection. This means not responding to their casual reach-outs, not engaging with their testing behavior, not accepting their return as sufficient evidence of caring or growth. It means being willing to lose them permanently if they are not willing to do the work that a sustained relationship with them would require. This is difficult because it requires you to give up hope that this time might be different, to accept that the person you want them to be is not the person they actually are without sustained therapeutic work, to recognize that your love and patience cannot fix attachment wounds that formed in childhood and have been reinforced through decades of defensive patterns. It requires accepting that the only thing that will motivate the avoidant to change is experiencing consequences severe enough that continuing their patterns becomes more painful than doing the work to transform them. And that consequence is you refusing to be available for the cycle to continue. The avoidant will likely not do this work even when you enforce boundaries. Most avoidants will simply find someone else to cycle with, someone else who will tolerate their patterns long enough to serve the same functions you were serving. But occasionally, losing someone who actually mattered because of their own patterns creates enough psychological crisis that the avoidant finally seeks the help they need. Whether they do or not is not your responsibility and not within your control. Your only responsibility is to protect yourself from a pattern that will damage you increasingly the longer you participate in it. To refuse to enable dysfunction that prevents the avoidant from confronting what they need to confront. To understand that accepting their returns is not love, it is participation in their avoidance of genuine growth. The choice that actually honors what you shared. If the connection you had with the avoidant mattered, if there was genuine potential beneath the dysfunction, if you want to honor what was real between you, the way to do that is not by accepting their return and giving the cycle another rotation. The way to honor real connection is by refusing to participate in the pattern that destroys it, by maintaining boundaries that force the avoidant to choose between doing genuine work or losing access to you permanently, by recognizing that enabling their avoidance is not loving them well. It is loving them in a way that allows them to stay broken. Real love for someone with avoidant attachment looks like requiring them to address their patterns rather than accommodating those patterns indefinitely. It looks like saying that you cannot be in relationship with someone who cannot show up, that their return without evidence of change is not acceptable, that you value yourself too much to continue participating in a dynamic that requires your self-abandonment. It looks like being willing to walk away permanently if they are not willing to do the work, because staying would mean accepting a relationship that can never actually satisfy your needs for genuine intimacy and consistent presence. The avoidant will not understand this as love. They will interpret your boundaries as abandonment, your refusal to accept their return as proof that you did not care as much as they thought, your requirement for change as unreasonable demands. But their interpretation does not change what is actually happening. You are refusing to enable their dysfunction. You are requiring genuine transformation. Rather than accepting the appearance of effort, you are protecting yourself from a pattern that would destroy you eventually if you allowed it to continue. The truth is that the avoidant keeps coming back because you let them, because your acceptance of their returns confirms that the pattern works, because they can continue being exactly as avoidant as they are while still having access to what you provide when they need it. The cycle continues until you break it by refusing to participate, by maintaining boundaries even when it hurts, by requiring that return be accompanied by genuine evidence of therapeutic work and sustained behavioral change. This is the only response that actually serves both people. It protects you from continued harm, and it creates the crisis the avoidant needs to finally confront, that their patterns require professional intervention rather than continued accommodation from people who love them, despite their inability to love back in sustainable ways.